Katerina Jaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hi, and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for March 5th, 2021. We've got an exciting show for you tonight, I think. Hopefully you will too, you, the viewers, the listeners. And so let me introduce myself. I'm Chris Driscoll, longtime socialist, Marxist-Leninist, revolutionary socialist activist. Long time, wow, like 50 years long. And along with me is our resident Marxist-Leninist scholar and analyst, interpreter, and last but not least, journalist, Rainer Shea. Hello, Rainer. How are you?
Hello. It sounds like you have 4 articles of mine that I've written this last week that we're going to discuss.
Yes.
And I'm going to discuss them.
Right. I've got 8 topics up tonight, and 4 of them are your responsibility, which thank the gods for that. Yeah. Anyway, yes, you're raring to go, I see. Biting at the bit, so let's launch right into the agenda. Topic number 1, this is one from Rainer Shea, Speak of the Devil. A new wave of socialist revolutions looms.
And these last couple of years, as I've been studying the conditions of global capitalism and the nature of Marxist-Leninist theory, I've come across this idea posited by this Indian guy, this Indian Marxist writer named, I think his name is Saikat Saborno. That might be his last name that I see on Facebook. He's posited this idea that a new wave of socialist revolutions is about to come. This is going to be in addition to the last 2 major waves of revolutions the first one, he says, spanned from the anti-colonial revolutions of the late 18th century to the Paris Commune. The second wave spanned from the Russian Revolution to the Sandinista Revolution. And the third one, it seems like the third one is going to begin most likely either in India or in Ecuador or in another hot spot for class struggle Latin American country like Chile or Colombia. I don't know if you can call what's happened in places like Venezuela or Bolivia revolutions, since what's happened there has been a popular movement on the part of the proletariat within these countries to force the bourgeois democracies to bend to the will of the people, and obviously that entails a lot of risks, a lot of leverage that the bourgeoisie can potentially get. And just a little over a year ago, the Bolivian bourgeoisie, in collaboration with the imperialists, overthrew the democratically elected Evo Morales and created a coup regime that terrorized the country for a full year. It seems like the first, we will be able to call it a full-on revolution when something like the Cuban Revolution happens next. When we next see something that involves the full-on uprooting of the state structure of a country, and there are places where the contradictions of neocolonialism are getting severe enough for such an upheaval to really be realistic. You look at Haiti, where almost all the population is very vulnerable to climate disruptions amid the pandemic and amid an economic crisis. You look at Honduras, where there's this U.S. installed dictatorship that's been inflicting all of this poverty and violence upon the country for so many years and has been forcing people to flee. You look at countries like these, and you can definitely see how they're going to be the springboards for this third wave of revolutions. And when this third wave of revolutions happens, it's going to mean big trouble for the imperialists, who have already been economically isolating themselves from Russia and China, and they need to step up their neocolonial exploitation. But obviously the proletariat within the neo-colonies are not going to stand for this forever. Something has to give.
Yes, I agree with you 100% there. And this fella from, what did you say is from India? I guess he was.
India.
India. What was his name?
His first name is Saykat. His last name, I think it might be Saborno. Okay,
I'll have to look him up. Send me an article from him if you have it, or something from him. I'll post it. Matter of fact, people should know I will post all of the referenced articles below when we post this on YouTube, so you'll be able to grab it there. Go see the sources of a lot of what we're saying. But yeah, a new wave of socialist revolution looms. I have had that same gut feeling and intellectual, analytical conclusion, Marxist-Leninist conclusion, for some time now. You really saw it in the last year and a half. Tremendous, even with the COVID plague disrupting everything in the world for over, what is it now, 8 months or whatever, since March, since mid-March, when the pandemic was first declared. But yeah, it's I see it in 1,000 different ways. I would not attempt to identify the country I think will be the first big next revolution, socialist revolution. I agree with you on Venezuela. Matter of fact, Venezuela will be our next topic, about a UN rapporteur who visited Venezuela and her conclusions, which are quite positive for our side, for the side of the global working class, for the side of the people. Yeah, what happened in Venezuela, whatever it was, 19 years ago, was that an anti-imperialist social democratic political party took power, took governmental power. So that gave Hugo Chavez the ability to establish a socialist government. But his socialist government has been struggling, even through a couple of coups d'etats against him, military pushed, however you pronounce that. Their government has been struggling with the fact that their socialist government, their anti-imperialist social democratic government, is forced to operate within a capitalist state structure. And as Marx and Engels pointed out in the Civil War in France, I think referring in the early 1870s and referring to the Paris Commune, you really need, if you're going to create a successful socialist revolution, you need to smash the state, not just take over control of the state or create a government that operates on top of a state, but you must literally smash the state, disassemble it, and start from scratch, building up from the bottom an authentic workers' socialist state. And there's no other way around that if you want to build authentic socialism. If you're just happy with making some nice reforms for the working class that will probably be temporary, like the European Social Democrats do, which have almost all been rolled back in the last 40 years, then what they did in Venezuela is great. And it is great. We shouldn't we shouldn't belittle what they've accomplished. They've made great strides in making the lives of working class people better in Venezuela. However, it's not permanent. It's not. It's always under threat from the capitalist state that it's working within. So it's not a permanent solution, and we should be looking towards a permanent solution. And that's what this guy from India is obviously talking about. Socialist revolutions, authentic socialist revolutions. I would not dare to predict which country. We can see huge eruptions going on in South America and in Central America as well, and huge threats by the imperialists against many of those countries, and a real class struggle going on there as a result. We can see huge eruptions in the United States with the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement. We can see huge eruptions in Europe over the last year and a half. We've seen an enormous eruption in the last 6 months in India. So India might be a really good candidate. Things are really getting hot there. But we see the trend headed in the direction of a new wave of socialist revolutions. Absolutely. So anyway, unless do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I bet we'll expand upon it as this goes on.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, topic number 2, UN rapporteur in Venezuela. Now, this let me see if I can find where I put this. Oh yeah, my reference to this comes from the Communist Party of Venezuela, and it's a statement by the Communist Party of Venezuela, the PCV as they call themselves, and they say the Communist Party of Venezuela welcomes the preliminary conclusions of the report presented by the special rapporteur of the United Nations, Elena Duhan, after her visit to Venezuela, where she points out that illegal sanctions have aggravated the calamities the Venezuelan people suffer, and that it represents a violation of human rights. The rapporteur has urged the governments of the United States and the European Union to lift these unilateral coercive measures, that's the sanctions, that were illegally imposed in order to promote a change of government. In other words, regime change. This was illegally imposed. And the reason that they say that this is illegally imposed is because the only sanctions that are legal are those that are sanctioned by the United Nations. And the United Nations did not sanction these sanctions, these economic coercive measures, as the Venezuelan CP calls it, against Venezuela. So it is illegal. The efforts, as the document points out, have been devastating, mainly in the most vulnerable sectors of society. People living in extreme poverty, women, children, workers, people with disabilities or chronic diseases, and the indigenous populations. Indigenous in this case basically means the Native Americans or Native Venezuelans, I guess you'd call them, the Indios, as they call it in Spanish, the Native American people that are from Venezuela. I should point out a UN rapporteur. Probably a lot of people are not familiar with that term, but that is a special envoy appointed by the United Nations to go to a country and observe or investigate and then draw conclusions and make a report. So this rapporteur's report is basically saying that the United States and its European allies are in violation of the law, that they're criminal, they're doing a criminal act against Venezuela. So there you have it, Rainer.
The same applies to Iran, where Biden has been continuing the coercive policy. As the same applies to Syria or any other number of these disobedient nations, which U.S. imperialism has been waging economic warfare against. I recently saw a headline saying that Syria is experiencing its own economic hell, despite Assad's victory in the war, and this is the best that the imperialists can do to destabilize these types of countries. The bright side, obviously, that is that the imperialists have failed in their regime change projects against all of these countries. whether it's Cuba or Iran or Venezuela or Syria. They also couldn't sustain their regime change plot. When it came to Venezuela, we'll see how they do in Ecuador as the people there try to get an anti-IMF candidate elected. But as for the masses within Cuba and Syria and Iran and Venezuela, especially, it seems there's going to be continued economic deprivation, and it doesn't seem like there's any way out of this, at least in the short term. The best sign that the best sign of hope that I've seen when it comes to these countries' struggles with overcoming the impacts of sanctions is China engaging in development and trade with China or with other rising powers like Russia and Iran. This is why Washington seeks to undermine China. Also, ultimately, Washington seeks to destroy the great epicenter for providing a lifeline to these countries, which it seeks to strangulate and then turn into more neo-colonies.
Yeah. Yeah, and we will have something a little bit later on about these sanctions being used, and the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, supposedly, even though they are government-sponsored organizations, that are used against China. Anyway, next on the list, Kshama Sawant, Socialist Alternative in collaboration with the capitalist ruling class. Socialist Alternative, BTW, is Kshama Sawant's political party that she has belonged to for several decades. And this is all about Seattle City Councilwoman Kshama Sawant, and an announcement she's recently made through the newspaper of the Socialist Alternative. One of the most famous socialists in America, Seattle City Councilwoman Kshama Sawant, has announced that she is joining the capitalist, imperialist, war-loving Democrat Party. And I'll explain that. Sad news, and an indication that even the small power she has achieved has corrupted her and turned her to the dark side. Her announcement, made in the paper of Socialist Action, a social democrat organization to which she has long belonged, actually says she has joined the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. But since DSA is nothing but a sliver rump caucus within the Democrat Party, this really means she has joined the capitalist class as a supporter by joining the Democrat Party. The DSA is basically social democrats who believe in operating within the Democrat Party. I could say they hide under the skirts of the Democrat Party. So they're basically Democrats. Democrats, big D Democrats. This was inevitable, seeing the way Socialist Alternative has moved steadily to the right and toward accommodating the capitalist class over the last few decades. I've known people in the Socialist Alternative, by the way, for many, many years, some of whom are no longer with that group, thankfully. And they were much, much better back in the 90s than they are now, even though even back then they had some big problems that marked them off as not quite socialist in the traditional sense. Maybe I'd say they were really social democrats all the way along, and just trying to hide it with a veneer of Marxist-Leninism. Anyway, in my opinion, Sawant and Socialist Alternative should be soundly and roundly condemned for this act of ultimate class collaboration. Remember what happened to the French collaborators after World War II? That's what should happen to these socialist class collaborators, these socialist class collaborators. That's it.
I was just reading Stalin's The Foundations of Leninism, and he was describing how in order to get to the Bolshevik Revolution, in order to get to the establishment of the Soviet Union and the establishment of a workers' democracy where the proletariat could actually determine its own fate, there had to be a point where the proletarians and the peasants rejected the social revolutionaries, I think they were called, and the Mensheviks, who were the most leftward. They were what Stalin described as the most leftward wing of the capitalist ruling class. These were people who claimed to be socialists, but who really did not support the idea of smashing the state, and who apparently said Stalin supported the imperialist war from the Russian Empire, which is definitely something that I can see a parallel to today when it comes to groups like the DSA or the Socialist Alternative, because groups like DSA have very much been promoting the anti-Chinese, anti-Russian Cold War narratives, also the war narratives that have related to Syria, Ukraine, and even Venezuela, which was evident a couple years ago when the DSA, Jacobin, and Haymarket sponsored an event that infamously featured regime change agents who were promoting propaganda against the socialist governments in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. I think China was mixed in there, unsurprisingly. These are the kinds of patterns that emerge throughout history when it comes to these kinds of class collaborationist socialists. These are how this is how counter-revolutionary sentiments are manufactured in these socialist organizations. We need to do what the Bolsheviks did. Obviously, we need to offer the masses an alternative to this pro-imperialist hegemony.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put and briefly stated. Okay, next on the list, the ruling class wants us to accept war as never ending. Take it away, Rainer Shea.
In my article, I observe the rationale that the US NATO ruling class uses to justify its endless perpetuation of war, because this is what the ruling class has been trying to get us to accept throughout these last 20 years, ever since 9/11 and the war on terror. Life in the United States has come with the implicit knowledge that war is going to continue for as long as we're alive. That war is never going to end, and I say this because even though people like Obama and Trump and Biden have claimed to want to end the forever wars, all that they've done is shift the war efforts towards things like drone warfare. All that they've done is reallocate forces to different areas. All that they've done is pretend to withdraw troops from places like Syria and Iraq, while actually not withdrawing them at all. This is what Trump did several times, and it was an infamously disingenuous aspect of his presidency, and something that's going to continue for as long as the United States continues to exist, this paradigm of endless, repetitive war efforts and an endless this endless reality of conflicts abroad, because the United States in these last couple decades has entered into an unprecedented crisis point for its imperial hegemony, where war is something that they need, that's necessary for them to perpetuate endlessly, so that they can retain their remaining imperial holdings, and so that they can keep up profits for big tech and the military industrial complex amid a great crisis of capitalism, which has obviously deepened in this last year. And so, with all of these factors necessitating the perpetuation of war, with all of these conditions that make it so that war is going to be endless for as long as the ruling class is in power, the ruling class has needed to invent rationales for perpetuating war. The rationale that they've come up with, I think it boils down to the idea that that the United States is facing a great, all-encompassing threat, which can only be fought back against through endless conflicts, through endless military buildup, through endless nuclear arms buildup, through endless drone warfare. Though Biden has so far quieted down the drone warfare, according to official reports at least. This is what was posited by Christopher Hitchens, the infamous neoconservative demagogue, 10 years ago in his defense of the continuation of the war in Afghanistan, where he said that he's essentially said that in order for civilization to survive, war needs to be endless. He used some nebulous definitions of terrorist, of nihilist, of totalitarianism to justify this position he took, that we really shouldn't expect for war to end.
Wow. Yeah, that was a big 180 from Hitchens, because Hitchens had always, prior to that, been fairly good, social democrat journalist, commentator, and typically not taking the side of imperialism in its endless wars. And then all of a sudden, on the after 9/11, basically, in reaction to, in supporting first the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and second the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was a real stretch because Iraq had been a mortal enemy of Al-Qaeda for decades prior to that, and fought valiantly against Al-Qaeda. So it was a real big stretch for these idiots to try to convince whole slews of other idiots that somehow Saddam Hussein, the mortal enemy of Al-Qaeda, was working hand in glove with Al-Qaeda. Is just ridiculous. And Christopher Hitchens was a big part of that. But yeah, I look at it from an economic perspective. I think crucial to this whole thing has been the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, something that Karl Marx predicted in the volume 3 of Das Kapital, and has been happening ever since, because the average global rate of profit when Marx wrote about that was 70-80% annually, and now you're lucky if you get somewhere between 4 and 8%. And it's really been dipping. I mean, in the last year, there was even a story about oil companies whose rate of profit was negative. Negative. It wasn't even a positive number. It was a negative number, which is really strange because there really isn't any such thing as negative profits. But what it really means is that those companies lost tremendous amounts of their stock owners' money, or of their investors' money. And when capitalism gets to the point, as it has, especially on and off again since the mid to late 1970s, when capitalism gets to the point where it can't return a profit to capitalist investors, the whole system collapses because there's no incentive to invest in productive investments if they're not producing profits. So the whole system tends towards collapsing, and they start doing some really drastic shit, which is what they have been doing, like with this quantitative easing, where they grab trillions of dollars out of thin air and create it out of nothing, which is just pure inflation in the long run. I mean, it always comes out as inflation one way or another. So it's they're really desperate. They're doing drastically desperate things, and part of that desperation is the ongoing, incessant, permanent, never-ending wars for conquest, for repression, for exploitation. They have several different objectives, and of course, one of those objectives sometimes is to actually destroy a country and to destroy that country's ability to create wealth. That's what they did to Libya, as an example. What does that do when they destroy a country? Well, it certainly doesn't raise the profits of those people who own stuff in Libya, who own like oil companies in Libya, for example. But what it does do is it eliminates that oil from the global market, which has a tendency of causing a scarcity, which boosts the price of oil, such that capitalists who own the major oil companies start gaining higher profits. And that's what we've been seeing since 2011, when Barack Obama deliberately set out to destroy the country of Libya. Yeah, it's incessant. It's and in a way, from the capitalist perspective, they must do this because the alternative is the death of their economic system, and probably its replacement with something much better like socialism. So yeah, they're desperate and they're going for it. Anyway, let's see what we got next on the agenda here. And I didn't say anything about the financial crash bigger than 2008. I agree with you 100% on that. By the way, I did read the article. Yeah, I mean, that's really what we are looking forward to in the coming, probably in the coming year. It's going to get a lot worse, people. It's going to get a lot worse. You think it's better because COVID-19 was the only reason for it? You're wrong. There are much deeper crises, much deeper contradictions that are incorporated in the capitalist system, especially here in the United States, where they've been pulling all kinds of trickery to try to keep this thing going long after it should have just long after they should have given up the ghost, because that's what this really is a capitalist. It's in its death agony, as Leon Trotsky used to use that term, death agony. Capitalism is in its death agony. It's in its final phase. Late capital, we call it, late capitalism. And yeah, we're starting to see some really big effects of that. Anyway, next on the list is Human Rights Watch, an impartial NGO, that's a non-governmental organization, is basically a nonprofit organization that goes around doing good stuff, supposedly, or a U.S. post-global war, post-Cold War zombie, asks Global Times, the Chinese Communist newspaper, the tabloid newspaper of the Communist Party of China. Anyway, I found this kind of an interesting article, and they go into, well, I'm just going to read you a couple passages from the article in the Global Times. I think it's that good that you deserve just to hear it right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Anti-China media outlets and certain so-called non-governmental organizations are colluding with secessionist forces to foment a rumor mill against China. Within this enormous mill, some NGOs claiming to be independent organizations often serve as research institutes to manufacture and spread rumors, with their so-called research findings being amplified in some Western media outlets. The Human Rights Watch, an organization that originated in the period during the Cold War, is one typical example. Recently, HRW, that's Human Rights Watch, released the World Report 2021, in which it fabricated hackneyed rumors related to China's Hong Kong Special Administrative Region and the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. While HRW claimed to be independent, Global Times reporters found its funding to be far from independent. In past decades, though it brandished words like human rights, everything from its undisclosed funding sources to its code of conduct, all of which all have highlighted a strong ideological stance, which has turned slogans such as just and independence it perpetually uses in its advocacy work into a laughing stock. A September 2016 article in The Nation magazine called attention to the unnerving number of leaders at Human Rights Watch who previously served as top government officials in the US government. This creates a conflict of interest between legitimate human rights work and US foreign policy, according to the magazine. A prime example of this is Human Rights Watch's Washington advocacy director, Tom Milenkowski, who worked as President Bill Clinton's special assistant and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's speechwriter. In 2013, Milenkowski left the Human Rights Watch when John Kerry nominated him for the position of Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. That's a funny joke as it is, according to Bergen magazine. So there you have it, Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch BTW is probably the most well-known human rights organization in the United States. headquartered in Washington, D.C., right down the street from the Capitol building and from the White House and so forth. One of its main founders was, I'm drawing a blank here. I just had the name in my head. Anyway, it was founded basically by a cabal of capitalist bigwigs, billionaires, who use it for the purpose of being a battering ram against places like China, like Russia, like Iran, like Venezuela. And this shabby, pitiful excuse for a human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, should really be condemned, in my opinion.
Yes, yes. I've been following Human Rights Watch and its behavior on and off these last few years, ever since I encountered the Human Rights Watch analyses on Syria, on the narrative that Assad had committed a chemical attack in April of 2018. I think this also applied to the April 2017 Syria controversy, and it's been a wake-up call to me about the true nature of all of these human rights organizations that are presented to the public, such as Amnesty International. There's another one that's pretty much an equivalent to Human Rights Watch. These organizations are not trustworthy, and when I realized just how untrustworthy they are, I was able to come to communism, and I was able to recognize that what we're told about China and North Korea in particular, that those are not true. That the Uyghur genocide claims, the claims of North Korean human rights abuses, and claims of the North Korean government stifling free expression, all of these come from the same kinds of fraudulent sources, and the emotionally manipulative wings of these narrative manipulation factories come from individuals like Yeonmi Park. I think that's her name. This North Korean defector who's famous by being propped up by this fraudulent human rights network and by fomenting demagoguery against the DPRK government by telling endless, ever more absurd lies about North Korea. I think one of those lies is there's no word for love in North Korea. They just put they just say things. That's all they do.
Yeah, they're. We should do something more expanded. This just happened to be an article that was in the Global Times the other day, and I usually read the Global Times. So I thought I'd throw it in the mix here. Global Times didn't really do a very good job of exposing the funding of Human Rights Watch. I've read other articles in the past, and I think I'll try to dig them up, that do a much better job of tying directly, showing how much of Human Rights Watch funding comes directly. Oh, George Soros. Why didn't I remember his name? George Soros was one of the founders, and it typically gives millions of dollars a year to Human Rights Watch. The U.S. State Department funnels massive amounts of money to Human Rights Watch through front groups, basically through fronts of it, through other NGOs that it has out there that it uses to funnel money to NGOs that it wants to fund. So that's why, I call this so-called NGOs, so-called non-governmental organizations, because these organizations are absolutely actually governmental organizations. And in this case, Human Rights Watch, as well as Amnesty International, these organizations are outright tools of imperialism, tools of American and European imperialism. There's no other way to put it. Once you get, so maybe we'll do something more thorough on this subject a little bit later on, because people, you know, people should be weary of these traps. And they are traps because, you know, if you're a good person, you probably do support human rights. Who wouldn't? And so you'd want to support organizations that claim to support human rights, and yet you have these wolves in sheep's clothing out there that you really need to watch out for. So Human Rights Watch is definitely one of those. Cold War zombie, I like that, the way Global Times put it. So anything more on that?
Well, I could point out the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is also a wolf in sheep's clothing,
Yes.
Though its logical bias is extremely apparent. It's a step up from Human Rights Watch because it, in addition to putting forth propaganda, all this State Department propaganda, it also puts forth some Nazi propaganda,
Yeah.
or at least propaganda that makes the Nazis look better in the eyes of history. It claims that the Soviet Union helped the Nazis carry out what they call a double genocide against the Jews, which is a narrative that rewrites the Holocaust in order to implicate the Soviets in this genocide, which I think this shows the liberal to fascist pipeline that can be entered into when you start to really buy into this kind of misinformation.
Yeah. Yeah, that particular group, the Memorial blah blah blah, Victims of Communism, they were a liberal group set up in I guess the 1960s first of all, as a another, you know, it was set up directly by Congress to use as a battering ram against the global working class, essentially. I wrote something about them yesterday that I put up. I think I put it up on Facebook. I'll have to go back and see. But the reason I wrote it is because they did a really fascinating poll in 2019 in which they found that 1/3 of youth in America favor communism over capitalism, which I found really fascinating. And of course, they did this as a sensationalist thing. You know, oh, we've got to do something fast because the youth are turning to communism. But it really goes to show that you know, the youth in this country, especially, and even some of the oldsters, are waking the fuck up. So great. Next topic: blackouts, resource deprivation, and martial law are our future. Rainer Shea.
Well, they're the future, at least, of pretty much everyone who isn't rich or who hasn't become a total and complete bootlicker who's directly employed by the rich to fight their battles for them. The events in Texas in this last month are a foreshadowing to what's going to happen throughout most of the country in these next couple of decades. And I say these next couple of decades because according to a 2019 Pentagon report, there's a very severe problem in U.S. infrastructure, which is going to come to a head apparently in these next couple of decades in particular. as global warming continues to produce ever more severe natural disasters. According to the report, most of U.S. electrical infrastructure is unprepared for the extreme weather events that are going to appear in these next 20 years. So as this breakdown of the electrical grid, of the food distribution networks, of basic social functionings occurs, the military is going to step in to impose what's essentially martial law. In 2016 U.S. Army war document, these military analysts outlined a vision for what life in the future domestic occupation zones in places like, say, LA or New York, or what life is going to be like after the Army decides to invade the United States from within. These places are going to be the most repressive dictatorships imaginable, where cell phone and internet access is potentially cut off, where the Army decides to go after potential online opinion influencers who might influence the public against the favor of the military in these sensitive situations, where the Army is going to be sent in to fight off anybody who's deemed to be an enemy combatant. See, all of this ties in, this shift into a dystopian near future. All of this ties in with the moves towards repression and dictatorship that we've been seeing in these last 20 years, with the war on terror and the suspension of our civil liberties and the expansion of the surveillance state. Of course, the mass surveillance is going to be another component of the dictatorship that they plan to impose on the urban areas that they plan to occupy in these next few decades. I think that the situation, I think that the conditions in this country are going to get far more dire as a result of these extreme weather events. The capitalist state is going to put these vulnerable, impoverished populations under martial law in a desperate attempt to retain social order. And their hope is that through these drastic measures, through this information clampdown, this censorship campaign, through another 2016 Pentagon training video describes as they imply that they're going to employ special operations forces. Through all of these measures, they hope that they will avoid a people's war within the United States, where the masses rise up and try to implement their own style of government. They hope that they'll be able to keep the masses disorganized, discombobulated, helpless enough for the military to pacify the population. And this is what I hope to avoid through my organizing efforts, through my building up of equipment for revolutionary survival within this local group that I'm organizing in. This is what I hope others around the country try to accomplish. I hope that you all try to build up the means for surviving the very violent, very resource deprived paradigm that the state is going to impose upon us.
Good advice. Really good advice. Yeah. It's funny. Today, I got a novel by a guy who's an anarchist science fiction writer. He was, I should say, because he's no longer with us. And he wrote a novel in the late 1960s, in which he predicts, through this novel, that America will become the most powerful, the most militarily powerful third world country on the globe, and a fascist dictatorship. And I thought, how uncanny in the 1960s that Spinrad, his name is Norman Spinrad, very popular science fiction writer in the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, and prolific. I mean, he wrote, God, I think like 37 novels and more than 200 short stories. And it's really kind of uncanny that a lot of what he's predicting in this novel, at least according to the descriptions I've been reading about it, are pretty much coming true, frighteningly so. Yeah, I mean, many science fiction writers, of course, have predicted all of the infrastructure collapse, the collapse due to global warming, the collapse due to just toxic pollution all over the world, as well as the general collapse economically into perpetual deep depression. And that really does seem to be the way we're going. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be the way we go, because we have an alternative. It's called socialist revolution. Look into it. Okay. Finally tonight, China's 2 sessions to set bold economic vision. Now, that 2 sessions comes in quotes. It's what in China, they call their annual meeting of their legislature, of their national legislature. The national legislature is called the National People's Congress. And I think starting on the weekend, the 2 sessions, the 2 sessions, in quotes, will begin. China has another legislative body that's made up of a couple hundred of the people who are in the National People's Congress that meets all the time. So they do have like a regular ongoing legislature as well. But the National People's Congress is the highest legislative body in this country, in China. A very democratic country, by the way, despite what you will be told by Human Rights Watch and by the State Department and the CIA and all the enemies of working class people all over the world. Anyway, this is also from Global Times. And Global Times says, as thousands of China's top legislators and political advisors prepare to convene in Beijing later this week, this is from a couple days ago, for the annual 2 sessions of the National People's Congress, they are tasked to review and discuss various policy priorities and sweeping development plans designed to further lift the country to new milestones in the next 15 years. A modern socialist power with world-leading national strength and global influence. That's their goal for 15 years from now. The annual legislative and political consultative sessions are usually a window into the policy agenda and various economic and social developments targets for the year. But coming at a crucial inflection point as the country transitions into a new 5-year plan and longer development visions, this year's meeting will also provide a clear direction and blueprint of where the world's second largest economy is headed, following decades of rapid growth and mounting internal and external risks. That would follow a precedent set in 2020 when China did not set a specific GDP target for the first time in decades, mainly due to COVID-19. But in keeping with, well, not just COVID-19, but also due to the fact that China, and I'll explain it here, China is moving towards a different kind of economy at lightning speed already. But in keeping with the country's shifting focus towards quality over quantity and reflecting mounting uncertainties, a specific numerical GDP target this year may not be released at the two sessions, and instead more emphasis will be put on jobs, consumer prices, fiscal and monetary policies, as well as risk aversion, some analysts said. Also at the core of the 14th five-year plan and the long-range objectives through 2035 are the ability to make breakthroughs in core technologies to reach tech independence as the US is escalating a tech race with China. Also in focus at this year's two sessions is a campaign to combat monopolies and what officials call disorderly expansion of capital. As regulations have been tightened for online financial and fintech sectors, that's financial technology sectors, in recent months. While in the past, China has focused on achieving high growth rates, with the onset of the 14th five-year plan, focus has now shifted to sustainable, eco-friendly development, high-quality living standards while avoiding the waste and pollution of the past. Along with many in the world today, the Chinese people and the CPC, the Communist Party of China, want better lives with expanding human potential, not just mountains of consumer crap made of plastic and ticky-tacky. And a lot of GDP is just that: waste, war, destruction, pollution, plastic garbage. You know what? We were having a discussion, a group of friends of mine and I over the weekend, we were having a discussion about GDP, and one of my friends who's very much into the environmental stuff, he's just saying GDP is just crap. He's an Indian guy, so he talks like with an Indian accent. It's just crap, you know. But we were talking about it. GDP goes up when there's a disaster. You know, I mean, they collect all the money spent, the billions lost, and the money spent on rebuilding those losses as GDP rises. The GDP figure includes mountains of waste, fraud, war. You know, war is all the costs of war is all included in the GDP. You know, so I mean, it really is not a very good measure of quality life, of human well-being. So I'm really happy to see that China's moving away from that, moving towards measures of higher quality life rather than just, you know, more garbage, you know, being inundated with more garbage like most Americans. Even relatively poor Americans are just plowed under with plastic garbage, with ticky-tacky nonsense. God, you should see some of it that my daughter collects around here. I mean, it's useless. Anyway, there you have it. Exciting new stuff going on in China.
You see these movements towards socialist development within China. You see the tangible ways that the Communist Party of China is utilizing Marxist-Leninist theory and also Mao Zedong thought to materially improve the lives of its people and also enact their own Green New Deal that's bringing China many years ahead of its official carbon emissions reduction goals. You see all of these positive ways that the PRC is moving forward, and you juxtapose it with this strange way that that many people who call themselves communists are portraying what the PRC is doing. They're portraying it as just another development towards imperialist hegemony, just another imperialist project, just another plutocratic bourgeois project. And this is a problem for the unity of the global communist movement, because because these kinds of sentiments pervade many of the prominent communist organizations in places like India and the Philippines. And we can give credit to the Communist Party of the Philippines or India, will seeing that they are under the influence of an ideology which can cause someone to exaggerate or fabricate contradictions within the Chinese system to portray it as revisionist, and that's the end of the story. This is a debate that is going to continue to go on throughout the 21st century. This debate isn't going away, because there's an inclination that many of these self-described communist groups, primarily they call themselves Maoists, that they have towards vilifying the PRC towards falsely portraying it as a capitalist imperialist power.
Well said, Brainer. Okay, that's it for us tonight, and thank you, Rainer, for your stupendous contributions, as always. Prolific as always. Keep it coming. And thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. Look for us again next week. In the meantime, I bid you sweet adieu, and I will hope you have a wonderful time until we see you again.